A man once spent 3 years restoring an old house nobody wanted. The roof leaked. The walls smelled like rain and age. People drove past it and laughed at the idea that anything beautiful could come from something so neglected. Even his own friends questioned why he kept pouring time into a place that seemed beyond repair. But every evening after work, he returned with quiet determination. Some nights he only fixed one board. Other nights he sat on the unfinished floor in silence because exhaustion had reached into his bones. There were seasons when it looked worse before it looked better. One afternoon, a neighbor finally asked him, "Why keep working on something that's taking this long?" And he answered with something simple. "Because I can already see what it will become. Most people cannot understand what is still unfinished. That is part of what makes waiting so lonely. You look at your life and wonder why certain prayers still seem suspended in silence, why opportunities closed, why relationships shifted, why doors you begged God to open remained firmly shut, while others walked effortlessly into the things you've been crying over for years. What hurts even more is that you've tried to stay faithful through it. You kept showing up, kept believing, kept trying not to become bitter. But deep down, there are moments when your heart quietly asks, "God, are you still doing something here?" Because silence can feel confusing when you expected movement. And yet some of the most important things God prepares happen underneath the surface, where nobody can see them yet. Roots grow in hidden places. A seed does not break open publicly. Even dawn arrives gradually, before anyone notices the sky changing color. There's something difficult about being in the middle of preparation. You don't fully belong to your old season anymore, but you also cannot touch what's ahead. It feels like standing in a hallway between two doors, hearing echoes from both directions, while not knowing how much longer you're supposed to wait. People often talk about breakthrough like it arrives suddenly, but rarely do they talk about the quiet shaping that comes before it, the uncomfortable stretching, the detours, the disappointments that forced you to grow in ways success never could. Sometimes God prepares the blessing by first preparing the person who will carry it. And preparation rarely feels exciting while it's happening. Joseph knew something about this. He carried dreams long before he carried influence. Before the palace came the pit. Before leadership came betrayal, false accusation, isolation, and years that probably made no sense at all. There had to be nights when he questioned whether the dream had disappeared completely. Yet the delay was not abandonment, it was construction. Some things cannot arrive before your spirit is ready to survive them. There's a verse in Isaiah that speaks gently into seasons like this. "Those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength." Book of Isaiah. The verse does not say waiting is easy. It says strength can still be formed there. Maybe that's what's happening with you now. Not punishment, not neglect, preparation. And preparation can look strangely ordinary. It may look like waking up every day while carrying disappointment nobody else notices. It may look like rebuilding confidence after rejection. It may look like learning to trust God again after something broke your heart. It may look like praying without immediate answers. People usually celebrate visible victories, but heaven also sees invisible endurance. The moments you almost gave up, but didn't. The nights you cried quietly and still chose faith the next morning. The private battles nobody applauded. Those moments matter more than you think. A woman once described grief as living in a house where all the furniture has been rearranged. That's what difficult seasons can feel like spiritually too. Familiar things suddenly feel unfamiliar. Your routines change. Your certainty changes. Even your prayers sound different. And maybe lately you've felt that shift. Maybe life has not unfolded the way you imagined by now. You expected more clarity, more stability, more answers. Instead, you've been walking through a fog where each step requires trust you didn't know you would need. But fog can be deceptive. It makes you think nothing exists beyond what you currently see. Meanwhile, entire landscapes are still there waiting beyond your limited vision. God sees beyond the fog. He sees the version of your story that hasn't unfolded yet. And sometimes what feels delayed is actually being protected. There are people who reach the very thing they prayed for too early and lost themselves inside it. Influence without maturity destroyed them. Relationships without healing wounded them further. Open doors without wisdom overwhelmed them. Timing matters more than we realize. A breakthrough that arrives before your heart is strengthened can become a burden instead of a blessing. So while you keep asking, why is this taking so long? There may be deeper work happening underneath your frustration. Maybe your patience is expanding. Maybe your discernment is sharpening. Maybe your dependence on God is becoming more real instead of merely emotional. Growth often feels invisible while it's occurring. Think about winter. Trees look lifeless to the untrained eye. Branches stand bare against cold skies, and everything appears inactive. But beneath frozen ground, systems are still working. Roots are still deepening. Preparation is still happening quietly, where no applause exists. Not every silent season is empty. Some are deeply alive, and perhaps this season is teaching you something success alone never could. How to remain grounded when emotions fluctuate, when circumstances disappoint, when life refuses to move according to your schedule. That kind of faith becomes steady, not loud, not performative, just real. There's a difference between shallow optimism and deeply rooted trust. One disappears when pressure arrives. The other survives storms because it was built in hidden places. Maybe God is building the second kind within you now. And even if nobody around you understands what you're carrying, heaven has not overlooked you. Not one exhausted prayer. Not one sleepless night. Not one tear you wiped away before anybody saw it. Sometimes the reason the process feels longer is because what God is preparing is larger than you imagined. A small answer may come quickly, but life-changing transformation usually unfolds slowly. That doesn't mean you have failed. It means the story is still unfolding, and somewhere inside you, even after everything, there's still a small part that believes something beautiful could happen again. Hold on to that, because hopeless people stop planting seeds, but hopeful people keep preparing for rain even before clouds appear. God often works that way, quietly, gradually, patiently, not absent, not indifferent, just deeper than immediate understanding. And maybe one day you'll look back at this exact season differently. Maybe you'll realize the silence was not proof that nothing was happening. Maybe it was evidence that foundations were being laid carefully enough to support what was coming next. Not everything unfinished is failing. Some things are becoming. There's a strange kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying invisible weight for too long. Not physical exhaustion alone, though that becomes part of it eventually. It's the kind that settles quietly into your thoughts. The kind that makes simple decisions feel heavier than they should. The kind that causes you to stare at the ceiling at night, wondering why your spirit feels tired, even when your day looked normal from the outside. You can smile in conversations and still feel worn down internally. You can keep functioning while quietly wondering how much longer you're supposed to hold on. And maybe that's where you've been lately. Not completely hopeless, just weary. The difficult thing about weariness is that it doesn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it arrives slowly through accumulated disappointments. A postponed prayer here, an unanswered question there, a closed door you thought would finally change everything. Little by little, discouragement begins trying to rewrite your expectations. You stop dreaming as freely. You stop anticipating good news. You start protecting yourself from hope because disappointment has become familiar. But familiar pain is still pain. And God never intended for you to build your identity around survival alone. There's a moment many people never talk about in difficult seasons: the temptation to settle emotionally. Not because you truly believe nothing good can happen, but because expecting less feels safer than being hurt again. So you lower your expectations quietly. You stop praying certain prayers. You stop imagining certain possibilities. You convince yourself that maybe getting through life is enough. But deep inside, something still aches for more. Not fame, not perfection, just peace, purpose, relief. A sense that your life is moving towards something meaningful again, that ache matters. Because sometimes the very hunger you're trying to suppress is evidence that God has not finished awakening hope inside you yet. A passage in Book of Psalms says, "Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning." The verse never denies the existence of night. It simply reminds us that darkness is not permanent. That can be hard to believe when you've been standing in emotional midnight for longer than expected. Still, morning has a way of arriving gradually. First, there's only a slight shift in the sky. Then shapes become clearer. Then warmth slowly returns. Dawn rarely appears all at once. Breakthroughs often unfold similarly, not always through one dramatic moment, sometimes through quiet restoration happening piece by piece. A healthier mindset. A conversation that changes direction. A small opportunity. A renewed sense of strength you didn't have last month. And because these shifts seem subtle initially, people often miss them while waiting for something louder. But small beginnings are still beginnings. A woman once shared how bamboo grows. For years after planting, almost nothing visible happens above ground. Watering continues. Care continues. Waiting continues. To anyone watching, it would seem pointless. Then suddenly, growth accelerates rapidly in a short period of time. But the rapid growth was never truly sudden. The roots had been developing the entire time. That's important to remember when your progress feels invisible. Invisible does not mean absent. Some roots are developing in your character right now that will support blessings your current version of yourself could not sustain yet. Maybe you're becoming emotionally stronger. Maybe your discernment is improving. Maybe your compassion is deepening, because suffering softened parts of you pride never could. Pain changes people, sometimes negatively, sometimes beautifully. And one of the quiet miracles of faith is that God can take seasons that nearly hardened you completely and somehow still produce tenderness from them. Not weakness. Tenderness. There's a difference. Weakness collapses under pressure. Tenderness remains compassionate despite pressure. That kind of heart is rare, especially in a world where disappointment often convinces people to become cynical just to avoid being hurt again. But cynicism slowly steals wonder from the soul. It trains you to expect failure before possibility, loss before restoration, silence before breakthrough. Faith does not mean pretending difficulties don't exist. It means refusing to believe difficulties have the final word. That's harder than people admit, because sometimes you pray sincerely and nothing changes immediately. Sometimes you do the right thing and still face setbacks. Sometimes you stay faithful through loneliness while watching others move ahead effortlessly. Comparison becomes dangerous in those moments. You begin measuring your behind-the-scenes process against somebody else's visible chapter. You wonder why their life seems to move smoothly while yours feels delayed. But comparison hides context. You rarely see the full story behind another person's life. And more importantly, your journey was never meant to unfold identically to theirs. God's timing with people is deeply personal. Some stories require longer preparation because the assignment attached to them is heavier than they realize. David spent years tending sheep before wearing a crown. Moses lived in obscurity long before leading people through impossible circumstances. Preparation often looks ordinary until the moment purpose suddenly becomes visible, and maybe your current season feels ordinary in frustrating ways. Wake up, work, try, pray, repeat. Yet hidden seasons still matter. A sculptor once explained that the most important part of shaping stone is removing what doesn't belong. Sometimes the process looks destructive before the beauty becomes recognizable. God works similarly in human hearts. Certain fears need to be removed. Certain unhealthy attachments. Certain versions of pride. Certain dependencies that quietly kept you from deeper trust. None of that feels pleasant while it's happening, but refinement rarely does. Rarely. There are moments when God's silence is not rejection, but invitation. An invitation to know Him beyond emotional highs, beyond quick answers, beyond circumstances that conveniently validate faith. Stable faith grows differently. It develops slowly, quietly, deeply. And maybe lately, you've underestimated how much growth has already happened inside you. A year ago, certain disappointments might have completely shattered your peace. Certain conversations might have destroyed your confidence. Certain delays might have made you abandon hope entirely. Yet somehow, despite the struggle, you're still here. Still listening, still searching, still believing, even if imperfectly. That matters more than you know. Because faith was never about performing strength flawlessly. Sometimes, faith simply looks like refusing to quit during confusing seasons. And confusion does not scare God. Questions do not offend him. Even strong believers have moments where they whisper, "I don't understand what you're doing." Honesty is not rebellion. Sometimes it's the beginning of deeper trust. So, if your heart has been carrying frustration, exhaustion, or uncertainty lately, you do not have to hide it behind polished spiritual language. Bring the real version of yourself to God. The disappointed version, the anxious version, the tired version. He already sees it anyway. And perhaps this is where something begins shifting. Not necessarily in your external circumstances immediately, but internally first. Because internal renewal often comes before external breakthrough. Before doors open publicly, courage is restored privately. Before clarity appears outwardly, peace starts returning inwardly. Maybe that's already happening in ways you haven't fully noticed yet. Maybe your spirit is slowly healing from things you never properly grieved. Maybe hope is quietly rebuilding itself beneath your discouragement. And maybe God is closer in this silent season than you realize. Sometimes I think we expect His presence to feel dramatic all the time. Thunder, certainty, immediate direction. But often His presence feels quieter than that, like strength arriving for one more day, like peace that briefly interrupts anxiety, like unexpected calm in the middle of uncertainty, like a whisper reminding you not to give up yet. God, I don't always understand the timing of my life. There are moments when I feel discouraged by how long certain prayers have remained unanswered. Sometimes I wonder if I'm moving in the right direction at all. But even here, in the middle of uncertainty, I ask you to steady my heart. Teach me not to confuse silence with abandonment. Help me trust that you are still working beneath what I can currently see. Restore the parts of me that have grown tired from disappointment. Give me wisdom for this season and peace for the waiting. And when fear tries to convince me that nothing will ever change, remind me that you are still capable of bringing light into places that feel stuck in darkness. I place my future into your hands again, even if my faith feels small today. Amen. There are breakthroughs that arrive loudly, and there are breakthroughs that begin quietly the moment a person decides not to surrender to despair anymore. Maybe yours is already beginning. A few years ago, a man planted an orchard on land that looked almost barren. The soil was uneven, dry in some places, rocky in others. People questioned the decision because nothing about the landscape suggested abundance. It looked like the kind of place where things struggled to survive. But every morning, he kept showing up, watering, clearing stones, checking routes nobody else could see. For a long time, the field appeared unchanged. No fruit, no visible progress, no evidence that all the effort was producing anything meaningful. Then one spring, small blossoms began appearing almost everywhere at once. What looked dead had been developing quietly the entire time. I think many people underestimate how often God works that way, not through constant spectacle, but through hidden formation. You may feel like nothing significant is happening because your circumstances have not changed dramatically yet. But internal transformation usually precedes visible breakthrough, and some of the deepest work God does cannot be measured by immediate results. It's measured by who you are becoming while you wait. The truth is, waiting exposes things. It reveals what we lean on emotionally, what we fear most, what we secretly believe about ourselves. And sometimes, difficult seasons uncover wounds we spent years trying to outrun through busyness, achievement, or distraction. Maybe this season forced you to confront loneliness differently, or insecurity, or disappointment you buried beneath constant activity. Healing is rarely convenient. Sometimes it feels like everything inside you is being rearranged at once. But healing also creates space. Space for healthier patterns, healthier relationships, a healthier understanding of God. There are people who spend years asking God to change their situation while avoiding the deeper transformation happening inside them. But God often cares about both. He is not only concerned with where you are going, He also cares about who you become when you arrive there. That matters because breakthroughs are not just about receiving something new. Sometimes they're about becoming someone new, more grounded, more compassionate, more spiritually awake. Not perfect, just transformed. A passage in Book of Romans says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him." That verse has comforted people for generations, not because it promises painless lives, but because it reminds us that pain itself does not get the final word. Even now, God can still create meaning from what felt wasted. The years you thought were lost, the detours, the failures you replay in your head, the season that nearly broke your confidence completely. None of it is beyond redemption. And redemption does not always mean erasing the past. Sometimes it means transforming the meaning of it. The very thing that once made you feel abandoned may eventually become the reason you can comfort someone else with genuine compassion. The struggle that exhausted you may become the source of wisdom that steadies another person later. Pain handled honestly often produces depth. Not immediately, not easily, but gradually. And maybe you've already noticed small signs of that depth forming inside you. You respond differently now. You notice things you once ignored. You value peace more than appearances. You care less about proving yourself constantly. Those changes matter, because not every breakthrough is material. Some of the greatest breakthroughs happen when anxiety no longer controls you the same way, when shame loses its grip, when fear stops dictating your future, when your soul finally exhales after years of tension. External blessings matter, of course. God cares about practical needs too. But sometimes we focus so intensely on one outcome that we overlook the quieter miracles already happening within us. The ability to hope again after disappointment is a miracle. The ability to trust again after heartbreak is a miracle. The ability to remain tender in a harsh world is a miracle. And perhaps that's part of what God has been protecting inside you all along. Because this world has a way of convincing people to become emotionally numb just to survive. After enough setbacks, many people stop expecting beauty altogether. They move through life guarded, detached, and quietly resigned. But resignation is not the same as peace. Real peace still leaves room for expectancy, not entitlement, not fantasy, expectancy. The quiet belief that God can still do something meaningful with your life, even after confusion, delay, and loss. That belief becomes powerful, especially after hardship tried to erase it. There's another truth people rarely mention. Sometimes the breakthrough you're praying for begins the moment you stop defining your worth by what has not happened yet, because delayed answers can slowly distort identity if you let them. You start believing, if this hasn't changed, maybe I'm forgotten. If this door stayed closed, maybe I'm not valuable. If this season lasted longer than expected, maybe I failed. But your worth was never supposed to be built on circumstances, not on income, not on relationship status, not on how quickly life unfolds. God's care for you existed long before your current struggle appeared, and it remains even here, even in uncertainty, even in waiting, even in seasons where your future still feels blurry. One of the hardest lessons faith teaches is that God's presence is not always measured by immediate outcomes. Sometimes He is closest during the very seasons where you feel stretched beyond your own understanding. Like a parent teaching a child to walk, there are moments where support remains present, even when the path feels shaky. You may not feel steady every day. That's okay. Faith was never meant to eliminate human emotion completely. There will still be mornings where doubt creeps in, moments where fear returns, days where you feel tired again. Growth is rarely linear, but healing can still be real even when it happens imperfectly. And perhaps tonight, instead of demanding that you have every answer immediately, God is simply inviting you to keep walking with Him one step at a time, one honest prayer at a time, one faithful decision at a time, one quiet act of trust at a time. Because eventually, what once felt impossible to imagine may suddenly stand in front of you, not because you forced it, not because you controlled every outcome, but because God continued working even during seasons where you could not fully see it. One day, you may realize the silence was preparing you to hear Him more clearly. The delay was deepening your roots. The closed doors were redirecting you away from things that would not have carried the peace you were truly searching for. And the breakthrough you thought would only change your circumstances may ultimately change your heart too. That's the thing about God's timing. Looking forward, it often feels confusing. Looking backward, it often reveals mercy you couldn't recognize while living through it. So, if your life feels unfinished right now, do not assume unfinished means forgotten. Some stories take longer because they are being written carefully. Some prayers take longer because the answer is larger than what you originally imagined. And some breakthroughs arrive quietly, almost unnoticed at first, until one day you realize you are no longer the same person who first began praying for them. Maybe that day is closer than you think. Not because life suddenly becomes perfect, not because every problem disappears overnight, but because God is still guiding you through this season, even here, still restoring, still preparing, still making room for something beautiful beyond your current understanding. So breathe again, not with forced optimism, not with pressure to pretend everything feels easy, just with the quiet understanding that your story is not over, and the God who carried you through every silent night has not stopped working now.